You are under arrest on suspicion of murder. What? You are under arrest on suspicion of murder? What do you mean that I am suspected of murder? A year ago, on the southern coast of England, a crime occurred that struck with its senseless cruelty. Bournemouth, usually known for its sandy beaches and resort atmosphere, became the site of a shocking tragedy that left its mark on the city's history. The investigation was not obvious and led the police to stunning discoveries. It all started when a tourist vacationing at Boscombe Beach came across two bundles that had rolled off a cliff. She decided to check the contents of one of them and immediately felt a horrific smell of decomposition. Inside were parts of a human body, severed legs. Bournemouth police immediately cordoned off the area, but initially there was no information about the victim's identity. Forensic experts, having analyzed the DNA, were able to identify the remains as belonging to Simon Sean, a 43-year-old man living in this area. Detectives began to reconstruct the chain of events. Security camera footage showed that shortly before disappearing, Simon was seen entering a house belonging to Benjamin Atkins and his girlfriend, Debbie Perry. Video recordings became a key piece of evidence as they confirmed that Simon did not leave the house. After that, the police decided to search Ben and Debbie's home. What they found there left no doubt about their guilt. Bloodstains belonging to Simon, his personal belongings, and the murder weapon. Ben and Debbie had long lived in poverty and had repeatedly fallen into the sights of law enforcement agencies. Their home, located in a disadvantaged area, was considered a dangerous place, and locals avoided it. Police discovered that the murder had been premeditated. The couple knew about Simon's trusting nature and used it to lure him into the house. The goal was robbery, but the situation got out of control, and it all ended in a brutal murder for £30. The investigation showed that Simon had tried to resist, but had no chance. Traces of a struggle in Ben and Debbie's house indicated that the resistance had been desperate but useless. The police arrested Ben and Debbie and took them into custody. Despite the clear evidence of their guilt, some officers still hoped they would be able to justify themselves. Simon's story shocked not only the local residents of Bournemouth, but the entire country. This city, usually attracting tourists with its entertainment and resort atmosphere, became the site of a tragedy that reminds everyone of what people in despair are capable of. Simon was known as a kind-hearted, easygoing person who never got into conflicts. His death became a symbol of senseless cruelty when greed and despair lead to the most terrible consequences. The police continued the investigation to understand how events developed and what exactly led to this tragedy. Their goal was not only to punish the perpetrators, but also to prevent similar crimes in the future. Despite the fact that the amount for which Simon died was negligible, Ben and Debbie's actions showed that even small profits can become a reason for a horrific act. Local residents were shocked that such a crime had occurred in their city. No one expected that such events could occur in a calm and peaceful place like Bournemouth had always been. But this event became a reminder that even in the quietest corners, terrible tragedies can occur. Now everyone knew that Ben and Debbie's house was not just a disadvantaged place, but a real scene of death. The police released information that the pair had planned to rob Simon in advance, hoping for an easy haul, but their plan failed and the situation got out of control. The investigation showed that they had acted according to a preconceived scenario, but were not prepared for the consequences of their actions. This crime became one of the loudest on the southern coast of England in recent years. The cruelty with which the murder was committed and its senselessness shocked everyone who followed the case. People were asking themselves, how could such a thing be done for such a small amount of money? And how could desperation and greed turn into deadly force? During that hot summer of 2023, Bournemouth, usually known as a place for relaxation and enjoying nature, became the site of a tragedy that changed the perception of the city forever. Local residents who were used to a peaceful life now knew that even in their hometown, something as terrible and unexplainable could happen.
Simon Sean's death remained in memory as a reminder that cruelty can hide where you least expect it. Soon after Simon's phone was found at a local pawn shop, Cash Creators, police began to advance in the investigation. Security camera footage installed in the pawn shop showed a woman selling the phone. She was quickly identified as Debbie Pereira, a 38-year-old local resident. Next to her on the footage was a middle-aged man who was later identified as Benjamin Atkins. This information became an important link in the case and allowed the investigators to focus their efforts on these two people. Before the terrible discovery of Simon's body in August, security guard Lee Gwileni spotted him at a dilapidated hotel, Mambo, on Manor Road. Lee described Simon as a quiet man, and they even exchanged phone numbers. Simon did not want to cause trouble for society and tried to avoid forbidden areas.
Lee recalled that a few weeks before disappearing, Simon reported that he had moved to Oldsbury Road, and it seemed that his affairs had begun to improve. But that was the last anyone knew of him. Simon Sean was known to authorities as a man without a permanent place of residence, who fought for survival, lived where he could find shelter, and often experienced difficulties. His recent arrest for possession of prohibited substances with intent to sell ended with his release on parole. After his release, he was under the supervision of the probation service, which later helped authorities identify his remains. In early August, the police had little information for the investigation. The only clues were Simon's mobile phone number and messages mentioning Oldsbury Road, where he supposedly moved. Detectives compared this information, trying to find additional leads. Their goal was not only to find the perpetrators, but also to gather information about the last days of Simon's life. Simon had suffered from addiction from a young age. He survived a difficult childhood, had problems with his studies, but despite this was hard-working. Having become an adult, he tried to establish his own life, but circumstances were often against him. Simon grabbed onto any work, at a warehouse, at a fair, performed general labor. He tried to maintain contact with his family, especially his mother, as well as his children, of whom he had several from different relationships. Problems with alcohol and forbidden substances made him a bad father, and his life was chaotic, with constant moves and debts. Over time, he became involved in work for the same dealers who fueled his addictions. Income from random jobs no longer covered his needs, and he began to run errands. This created a vicious circle. Addictions pushed him into a criminal path, which in turn worsened his situation. Experiencing shame, he began to distance himself from his family and friends. He didn't want them to see his deteriorating condition. He began to isolate himself more and more, with the exception of his son, Wesley, who remained especially close to him. Wesley was a 19-year-old young man who would soon have to learn about his father's death. Although Simon was not always around, the memories of the time spent together were important to Wesley. They shared a passion for motorsports, whether cars or motorcycles. Wesley knew that his father desperately wanted to change his life for himself and his family, but the addictions turned out to be too strong, and dealing with them was extremely difficult. Working as a seller of prohibited drugs, Simon performed chores that required him to work 12 hours a day. In the end, he was arrested and received a probationary term, but soon disappeared from sight. The police continued to gather clues. One of the main tasks was to find the remaining parts of Simon's body, which could help in catching his killers and calming his grieving family. The investigation also included tracking his mobile phone, which, as it turned out, played a key role. The mobile phone was sold at a pawn shop, and this error led the police to important clues. Selling the phone through such an obvious channel was a serious short-sightedness on the part of the criminals, and this oversight helped detectives advance in the case.
The police seized recordings from the pawn shop security cameras, which allowed them to identify Debbie and Benjamin, giving the police a new turn for continuing the investigation. On September 1, 2024, the police came to Debbie Pereira and Benjamin Atkins living in apartment 18B on Oldsbury Road. The address was established after the manager of the dilapidated hotel reported to the police about a conversation with Simon in which he called the street to which he had moved. On the same day, Debbie and Ben were arrested on suspicion of murdering Simon Sean. Their arrest was recorded on the police camera as required by British standards. The lead officer, Neil Tord, was initially skeptical of their guilt. He assumed that the phone found with Debbie could have simply accidentally fallen into her hands. However, further events showed that he was mistaken. The police carefully searched the apartment and the adjacent garden in search of evidence. The next morning after the search, severed hands of Simon were found in the shed. This discovery became decisive evidence and forced the detectives to officially accuse Debbie and Ben of murder on September 4. 5 days after their arrest, a patrol officer walking the gardens with bosom chained came across a headless torso and a black suitcase. A sharp smell familiar to every officer helped find this terrifying discovery. Post-mortem examination of the body parts showed that the amputations had been made neatly, but without professional skills, which pointed to an amateur attempt to hide clues. Nevertheless, Simon's head was still not found, which required continuing the investigation and more thorough interrogations. Before his disappearance, Simon Sean struggled to survive, not having a permanent place of residence and trying to cope with a difficult past. He was recently released on parole after serving time for possession of narcotics for sale. In the last week, he was seen at a dilapidated hotel on Manor Road. Officer Lee Glawonally described him as a quiet man who tried not to disturb the order. They exchanged phone numbers, and Lee knew that Simon had moved to Oldsbury Road, hoping to improve his life. But that was the last news about him. The police carefully searched the apartment and the adjacent garden in search of evidence. The next morning after the search, severed hands of Simon were found in the shed. This discovery became decisive evidence and forced the detectives to officially accuse Debbie and Ben of murder on September 4. 5 days after their arrest, a patrol officer walking the gardens with bosom chain came across a headless torso and a black suitcase. A sharp smell familiar to every officer helped find this terrifying discovery. Post-mortem examination of the body parts showed that the amputations had been made neatly, but without professional skills, which pointed to an amateur attempt to hide clues. Nevertheless, Simon's head was still not found, which required continuing the investigation and more thorough interrogations. Before his disappearance, Simon Sean struggled to survive, not having a permanent place of residence and trying to cope with a difficult past. He was recently released on parole after serving time for possession of narcotics for sale. In the last week, he was seen at a dilapidated hotel on Manor Road. Officer Lee Glawonally described him as a quiet man who tried not to disturb the order. They exchanged phone numbers, and Lee knew that Simon had moved to Oldsbury Road, hoping to improve his life, but that was the last news about him. Simon had suffered from addiction from a young age. He grew up in difficult conditions, had problems with his studies, but tried to be hardworking. Having become an adult, he tried to establish his own life. However, addictions constantly destroyed his efforts. He grabbed onto any work to at least somehow earn a living, but alcohol and drugs made him a bad father and forced him to move from place to place, leaving debts behind. His only comfort remained his son, Wesley, with whom they shared a love for motorsports. Wesley was 19 years old when he learned about his father's death. Although Simon was not always around, the time spent together left important memories for Wesley. Simon wanted to change his life for the sake of his family, but the addictions were too strong. In the end, Simon became involved in criminal activity, working for dealers who fueled his addictions. He performed errands for drug traffickers, which in the final count led to his arrest and probationary term, after which he disappeared from sight. The main clue for the police was Simon's mobile phone, sold at a local pawn shop, Cash Creators. Selling the phone was a serious mistake by the criminals, and thanks to this oversight, the police were able to advance in the case.
Security camera recordings from the pawn shop helped establish the identity of Debbie Pereira and later Benjamin Atkins. This allowed the police to focus their efforts on this pair and start searches and interrogations. Debbie and Ben were drawn into this story not by chance. Ben grew up in Oxford with a single mother and survived a difficult childhood, especially after the appearance of a cruel stepfather.
His only support was his grandmother, but her death deprived him of his last bastion of stability, and he descended into drug use. After getting to know Debbie through social networks, they quickly moved in together and began living together. Debbie also survived a difficult childhood. She was adopted by an aunt after her mother gave birth to her at a young age. The adoptive father was cruel to her, and his friends mocked her from an early age. These circumstances formed her life, and later she ended up in a relationship with Ben. Despite his problems and criminal past, a connection arose between them that held them together. As time passed, the police continued to gather clues and search for the remaining parts of Simon's body, trying to get to the truth and understand all the circumstances of this crime. Simon's remains were found in different parts of Bournemouth. This left the police in bewilderment, and an investigation began that led them to the perpetrators, Ben and Debbie. They were caught selling Simon's mobile phone, and the security camera footage became a key clue.
In the footage, it was visible how Ben and Debbie were stealing a large hacksaw, which later became one of the main objects linking them to the disappearance of Simon. Ben and Debbie met in a rehabilitation center where both were trying to get rid of their addictions. However, neither of them showed any special interest in recovery, and leaving the center, they returned to their old lifestyle, strengthening each other in their pernicious habits. Debbie had long been trying to cope with the addiction, but met Ben exactly at the moment when his attempt failed. Debbie already had a long history of communication with law enforcement agencies. She had 12 convictions and 19 misdemeanors. She also tried to get rid of a heroin addiction, which she acquired at the age of 29 through her partner, and which lasted more than 10 years. Together with Ben, they ended up in a vicious circle where there was no place for attempts to establish a life. When they met Simon, he was in a difficult situation. Ben and Debbie offered him a place for living, a tent in their garden. Simon had no other choice and reluctantly accepted their offer. However, for this he had to pay with prohibited substances in the amount of £40 a day, which became an unbearable burden for him. Simon was an ordinary dealer who met Ben and Debbie in places where they were often, and he was forced to go into such a disadvantageous deal in exchange for a roof over his head. Since then, Simon was no longer seen alive by anyone. Ben and Debbie were in a difficult situation after Simon's remains were discovered. They claimed that they knew nothing, but clues including camera footage and testimonies about the sale of Simon's phone pointed to their involvement. Cameras captured the moment when Ben and Debbie were committing the theft of a large hacksaw, which subsequently turned out to be connected with the dismemberment of the body. The police arrested Ben and Debbie, and they were interrogated separately, and their stories began to coincide. Debbie asserted that her participation was minimal and tried to present herself as a victim of circumstances. However, when clues began to accumulate, the police were able to restore the sequence of events and understand how a vicious circle of narcotics and addiction led to the death of Simon. Debbie had been in one abusive relationship after another throughout her life, which even more contributed to her problems with narcotics. She practically did not communicate with children. It was difficult for her to be a mother in conditions of constant addiction and violence. Ben, who seemed to her initially more supportive and caring, turned out to be just as controlling and proprietary as her previous partners. Now, when the pair were arrested, they had to choose, tell the truth and try to mitigate punishment, or continue to deny their involvement. Clues against them were collected from different places of the crime, and both suspects were interrogated separately until a complete picture of the shocking events leading to Simon's death was compiled. Several fragments of the skull were discovered on Walpole Lane in February 2024, 5 months after Simon's disappearance. These remains were identified as belonging to Simon Sean, which allowed the investigation to begin. Soon it was clarified that Ben and Debbie, a pair with serious problems with narcotics, were involved in his death. Records from the mobile phones of Ben and Debbie showed that Simon was with them at home and that Ben was trying to get more narcotics from Simon, using blackmail. He threatened to report the officer of the probation and not the lawful activity of Simon if he did not fulfill his requirements. Between three people arose tension. The situation worsened when Simon stood up to defend Debbie during one of the conflicts with Ben.
Debbie shared her experiences with Simon, telling about the difficult relationships with Ben. The three were forced to live in a cramped one-room apartment, and the atmosphere became unbearable. August 17, 2023, the situation reached a critical point. Ben accused Simon of stealing 30 pounds sterling in order to buy more prohibited substances, which caused even more tension between them. Simon wrote to his friend that he no longer felt safe, but did not have time to find another place. In a warm summer evening, Ben and Debbie were under the influence of narcotics when Ben again accused Simon of stealing money. A conflict began and Debbie got scared and went into the bedroom, leaving Ben and Simon arguing. During the argument, a knife appeared. Ben did not clarify where the knife came from and who took it first, but recognized that the knife was involved in the fight. Simon received multiple wounds, and Ben finished the attack, hitting him with a portable speaker on the head. Simon, exhausted and sick, did not represent a threat for Ben, but received 12 knife wounds, which became the cause of his death. Walls of the outbuilding were stained with blood. After Simon fell, he tried to call for help, but Ben did not stop. He gouged his eyes out and finished him with a speaker. Debbie did not interfere and stayed with Ben after this shocking incident. They sold Simon's phone, stole a hacksaw, and began to dismember the body. Ben performed the main part of the work, following instructions from a book on anatomy. He lit a fire in the garden in order to burn parts of the body, starting with the head. This process lasted several days, and neighbors began to notice a disgusting smell. Ben and Debbie explained it with dead mice. When the head was not completely burned, Ben decided to get rid of the remains, throwing them on Walpole Lane. Police went to the trail of the pair after the discovery of fragments of the skull. Soon became known details of what was happening in the apartment. Debbie helped hide signs of the crime. She spent several days cleaning the blood-stained premise before the walls were repainted. Also, she sold Simon's phone and helped get rid of parts of the body. Neither of them showed repentance. Ben even joked about how Simon pleaded for mercy. He asserted that acted in order of self-defense, but his physical superiority over the exhausted Simon made these statements false. When evidence and confessions were collected, Ben and Debbie appeared before the court in May 2024. They did not express sincere repentance. The judge noted that violence was unnecessary and disproportionate. Ben was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years, and Debbie received 4 years for obstructing justice. The prosecution noted that if Debbie had called the police, Simon could have remained alive. In court, Simon's son, Wesley, expressed his grief, telling how his father used forbidden substances to cope with problems, but did not deserve such a fate. Simon left behind a family which now mourns his loss. He fought with addiction and wanted to change his life for the sake of his loved ones, but did not succeed. Now his killers are behind bars. Horrors on the Southern Coast, a story from which blood freezes, a dismembered horror.